Hello, my name's Tom, welcome back to my channel where I talk a little bit about theatre, a little bit about being a PhD student, and a little bit about those two things lashed together. Today, another episode of What the Theory, and we're building on some of those ideas that I looked at in my last What the Theory video around semiotics to look at the concept of cultural texts. As always, if you've got any further questions or any ideas for other videos I could make, please do drop them in the comments down below. I'm always really keen that these are kind of the start of a conversation rather than the end of one, and also to be really responsive to what people want to see videos about. But here we go with today's video on cultural texts. So, in the last episode of What the Theory, we looked at semiotics and the process through which words, symbols and images come to take on meaning. If you haven't watched that video, I perhaps suggest going back and watching that one first, just because we're going to kind of carry on from where we left off there. I will link it up in whichever corner those go in, and then pop on back to watch this one. When we were looking at semiotics, we were zooming right in and focusing on what individual words or symbols might mean and how they come to mean that thing. But unless you're a linguist or a symbologist or a character in a Dan Brown book, then individual words and symbols might not be that interesting to you. Where they do perhaps come more interesting to those of us in the wider humanities is when they get knitted together into broader things which we call cultural texts. The term text is thrown around quite a lot in academia, but I quite often find that when we come to talk to people outside of the humanities around what a text is, our use of it can seem a little bit odd. In colloquial terms, text tends to mean a group of letters grouped up into words and sentences and paragraphs, either on paper or on a screen. However, when we use it in cultural studies and in the humanities and in academia more generally, we use it to describe all kinds of things, from books to films to adverts to even sometimes cities and people. Now, the reason that we describe all these very different things as texts is something that I think, depending on how your brain works, will either slot into place quite quickly or perhaps take a little bit longer to get your head around. But today I'm going to try and explain why we use this word text and what it means to describe so many different diverse things. So to begin to understand what a cultural text is, I want to start from that very colloquial definition of groups of letters and words on paper. Because our broad understanding of what a cultural text is does have its roots in literary studies. Up until just after the middle of the 20th century, pieces of literature were more often referred to as works or works of literature. Now, the term work was incredibly loaded, and much time was spent deciding which bits of literature might be a literary work and which didn't deserve that title. And there's a particularly interesting discussion about this in Terry Eagleton's Literary Theory and Introduction, in which he looks at the notion of how the context surrounding a bit of literature helps us to decide whether we might perceive it to be a literary work or to not be so. Again, there was a book published recently which played with this idea, which took the words of Vine creators and presented them in the format that you'd usually find a contemporary poetry collection. Furthermore, when analysing works, scholars assumed there to be a definite, concrete meaning of that work of literature. A piece of literature meant whatever the author intended it to mean, and any other interpretation of that was deemed strictly wrong. So, when during the 1960s and 1970s scholars wanted to move past this notion of the literary work, they decided that the old term was too laden with old prejudices and old ideas, and that a new approach to pieces of literature required a new terminology. And thus the text was born. Although not the first to come up with the term, it was Roland Barthes who most influentially laid out the difference between a work and text in his essay From Work to Text, which I will link in the description down below. Barthes actually lists 7 points of differentiation between a work and a text, but I'm just going to draw on a few of the key ones here. So, a text is not the book. It's not the format through which the ideas within are communicated to us, but those ideas themselves. And as such, when we're analysing or approaching texts, we're less interested in the form in which it's presented to us and the context in which it's framed. Furthermore, a text has no definite meaning. In fact, it contains multiple and potentially infinite different meanings. Using the terms from my previous video, Barthes suggested that a work was everything from the signifier to the signified, while a text was everything that happens after that process of the work coming into contact with a reader, and therefore different readers would have different interpretations of the same piece of literature. Finally, for today, there was to be no attempt to draw a big black line around what was considered a text and what wasn't. Any piece of writing could be approached as a text. The idea was to throw off those old prejudices of what was included in the canon or the tradition and what wasn't, and suggest that we can analyse any piece of writing through the same critical methods. With this idea that formal context is less important, we might begin to see how the idea of the text began to expand beyond just literature. If we're going to approach J.K. Rowling with the same outset as we do approach Shakespeare, then why not start to look at pieces of culture that communicate things through methods other than words? Because, as we discussed in my last video, the methods through which we communicate tend to be quite similar no matter what form they take, whether they're words on paper, whether they're images, or whether they're physical movement. So, taking this a step further, why shouldn't we approach other forms of communication through the same critical frameworks that we apply to literary texts? Talking about texts rather than works, then, allows us to open up our concept of what might be a worthwhile object of study. In short, it democratises theory. It allows us to take the same approach to an episode of The Simpsons than we might to a work of Proust. The scholar Richard Rorty describes any theorist who thinks a text to only be a piece of literature to be a weak textualist. And there's this idea that's increasingly evolving that a text is absolutely anything through which there is communication involved, and therefore almost any phenomena on earth could be described as a text because it is something that is communicated and can be read by a reader. Today, however, let's stick with what we might call cultural texts. Those things like performances, or films, or books, or pieces of visual art, or pieces of sculpture, which aim to communicate cultural ideas through some kind of artistic form. And I'd like to close with some thoughts about why this idea of the cultural text might be incredibly useful in cultural studies and in the humanities as a whole. First off, it allows the incredibly powerful tools that theory gifts us to be applied to much wider culture. For a long time, the ideas that are bound up in theory were held hostage by literature. By expanding the notion of what a text is, we can use those same critical techniques to approach everything from television adverts to billboards to pieces of pop culture that we might use to apply to Shakespeare. All of these things will have ideologies and power dynamics bound up within them, and so it's great that we can use these same tools to analyse pieces of culture wherever they appear. Secondly, it takes away any regard of the intention of the author. This does a couple of things. It takes away that notion that the author is some kind of deity who has gifted us this great bit of art, but it also allows us to not have to be bound up in whatever the assumed intention of the author was. If you went to a gallery and saw an extremely abstract piece of art which you couldn't understand, it would be very, very hard for the artist who created it to convince you that in actual fact you definitely did understand it. And in the same way, it would be wrong to consider the author's intentional meaning to be the meaning that everyone who comes into contact with that text takes away from it. Finally, the concept of the text unleashes a piece of culture from its temporal specificity. It suggests that it can change meaning over time as society changes and shifts, and across different societies across the globe as it is. In this regard, a text is only brought into being when it comes into contact with its readers, and therefore, depending on who those readers are and the other bits of culture that surround it, this will have an effect on what that piece of text comes to mean. The concept of the text, therefore, allows us to free the ideas communicated through a piece of culture from the physical form which they take in their communication. As such, it allows us to set aside the deification of the individual or individuals who created that piece of work, and rather than focus on the process that led up to the creation of that piece of culture, focus instead on the effect effects that it has. Thank you very much for watching this episode of What the Theory. For those of you who have been kind enough to subscribe to my channel, I recently reached 1,000 subscribers, which was really lovely. So thank you very much for doing so. It makes this kind of feel very worthwhile and helps me to know that it is useful to some people. I'm going to put some extra reading and some sources down in the description below, as I quite often usually do. But until next time, have a great holidays.